Right, so this is the image of the porch guy without the backpack. Now, you're about to see some magic here by doing hardly anything. And let me know who you see in this image. Okay. As you can see, nothing AI going on. Yep. Nothing. Nada. Absolute. In fact, look, you can see the AI stylizes up there. We're just on adjust settings. So nothing going on at all. Now, it's time to expose you, and it's a very apt slider. Can you tell who it is yet? Wow. Just wow.
The previous video laid out a chain of events that, at first glance, looked impossible to ignore. A 4-hour window that raised questions. Strange activity surrounding the house. A power of attorney signed months before a disappearance that would later dominate national headlines. Investigators returning to the same location over and over again. Piece after piece began stacking on top of each other until many people felt they were staring at a picture that was slowly becoming complete. But there was a problem. A serious problem. A problem large enough to potentially tear apart the entire theory. Because despite all the coincidences, despite all the unusual timing, despite all the attention surrounding the people closest to this case, one detail sat in the middle of everything like a crack running through concrete. The man captured in the surveillance footage didn't seem to fit. And that changes everything. Welcome back to Apex Crime Analyst. Tonight we are not beginning with answers. We're beginning with the one detail nobody can comfortably explain away. Because if the theory surrounding this case has a weak point, this is it. And if that weak point can be solved, then the entire story begins to look very different. The footage released by investigators gave the public something tangible. For the first time, people had something they could measure, compare, dissect, and examine frame by frame. The suspect was described as approximately 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall. Average build. Facial hair visible beneath the mask. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing unique enough to immediately point toward one person. But enough to create parameters. Enough to establish boundaries. And almost immediately people began comparing those boundaries to the individual who had become the center of growing public discussion. Then a problem appeared. Multiple observers began noticing something that didn't sit right. The height. Photographs taken publicly over the years seemed to show a noticeable difference. Standing beside other people. Appearing in social gatherings. Existing in ordinary moments frozen by cameras. The proportions did not seem to align neatly with the description investigators had released. Maybe photographs distort perspective. Maybe angles create illusions. Maybe estimates are imperfect. All true, but the problem remained. If the person many had focused on did not physically match the suspect description, then where does that leave everything else? Because theories are only as strong as their weakest point. You can build 10 strong arguments, but if the foundation beneath them collapses, everything built above it falls with it. And for a while, that is exactly where this story seemed to be headed, toward collapse. But then another possibility emerged. Not from a rumor, not from anonymous social media speculation, not from message boards, from records, from years of history, from connections that had existed quietly in the background long before anyone was paying attention. Because sometimes investigations do not move in straight lines. Sometimes they move sideways. You stop staring directly at the center and begin looking at the people standing near it. And that is where a name begins appearing. Again, and again, and again. Not a stranger. Not someone who suddenly entered the story. Someone who had already been there. Someone connected by years of history. Someone who had remained almost invisible while public attention focused elsewhere. Dominic Aaron Lee Evans. Now before we go any further, something needs to be stated clearly. Very clearly. Because in cases like this, people become reckless. Speculation starts becoming accusations. Questions become conclusions. And that is dangerous territory. Public records are facts. Relationships are facts. Locations are facts. But guilt is not established by internet theories. It is not established by photographs. And it is not established by public suspicion. That distinction matters. Always. Because investigations depend on evidence, not assumptions. But evidence often begins with patterns, and patterns are where this story becomes difficult to ignore. The reason this name matters isn't because of dramatic headlines. It isn't because someone on social media circled a face in a photograph. And it isn't because of one isolated coincidence. It matters because of timing, because of access, because of proximity, because sometimes the people standing closest to the center of a story are not standing there by accident. Think about how investigations usually work. People imagine detectives sitting around waiting for one giant breakthrough, one fingerprint, one confession, one smoking gun. Reality rarely works like that. Real investigations are often far less dramatic. They involve tiny pieces, small details, pieces that individually look meaningless, until suddenly they begin fitting together. Imagine dumping 1,000 puzzle pieces onto a table. At first you see chaos. Nothing connects. Nothing makes sense. Then you find 2 matching pieces. Then 4. Then 10. Slowly a picture begins emerging. But if one piece suddenly doesn't fit, you don't throw away the entire puzzle. You start looking for another piece. And right now that missing piece may be standing in the background. Because if the surveillance suspect does not fit one person, then maybe people have been asking the wrong question entirely. Maybe the question was never, was this the person on the porch? Maybe the real question is, who else could have been there? Because that changes the framework completely. Now the possibility becomes larger than a single individual. Now the possibility becomes something involving roles, responsibilities, separate functions, someone who knows, someone who acts, someone who plans, someone who executes. And suddenly the height problem that seemed capable of destroying everything begins looking less like a fatal flaw and more like a missing link. Because imagine planning something complicated. Imagine needing information, knowledge of routines, knowledge of schedules, knowledge of access points, knowledge of habits. Then imagine needing someone else willing to physically take risks, willing to move, willing to enter, willing to carry out actions directly. Those are not always the same person. And throughout criminal history, they often are not. One person creates the plan. Another person carries it out. One person provides intelligence. The other provides execution. And if that possibility exists here, then suddenly the conversation changes. Because now people aren't asking, does one individual fit everything? They're asking, do multiple people fit different pieces? That question creates a completely different investigation. Because once multiple people enter the equation, previous contradictions stop looking like dead ends. Now they start looking like missing sections of a larger picture. And maybe that larger picture has been sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice it, waiting for someone to stop looking directly at the center and start examining the edges. Because the edges are where hidden things live. The people nobody initially pays attention to. The names that don't appear in headlines. The faces that stay in the background. The individuals who remain close enough to matter but distant enough to avoid scrutiny. Those people often become important later. Very important. And tonight we are beginning there. Not with conclusions. Not with accusations. But with questions. Because there is still someone missing. Nancy Guthrie remains missing. That fact outweighs every theory. Every debate. Every online argument. Every photograph. Every rumor. At the center of all of this is an 84-year-old woman whose family still does not have answers. And somewhere inside this maze of timelines, relationships, and evidence sits the truth. The only question is whether investigators are getting closer to it. Because if they are, someone out there already knows. Someone has known from the beginning. And eventually silence becomes harder to maintain. Especially when evidence starts speaking. Especially when records start speaking. Especially when technology starts speaking. And if this story truly contains a missing piece, eventually that piece will surface. Eventually the picture will either become clearer or fall apart entirely. And we're only getting started. On the next part, we go back nearly 20 years and uncover a connection that may explain why this name matters at all. Because strangers don't always enter stories suddenly. Sometimes they've been standing beside each other for decades. If you're following this investigation and want every development broken down piece by piece, subscribe and turn on notifications for Apex Crime Analyst, because we're going to keep pulling records, tracking developments, and following the evidence wherever it leads. Several years before national headlines, before surveillance footage, before FBI briefings and thousands of public tips, Before internet communities started pulling apart timelines frame by frame, there was something far more ordinary taking place. No mystery, no investigation, no disappearing person, just three people who, like thousands of others, were trying to connect through music. Sometimes the beginnings of stories that later become enormous don't look important when they first happen. There are no warning signs, no dramatic moments, no sense that one day strangers across the country will be analyzing names and timelines connected to those individuals. At the time, it was simply life moving forward. But looking backward can make ordinary moments feel very different. In the last part, we focused on a major problem in the theory surrounding this case. A physical description that didn't seem to align neatly with the person many had been discussing publicly. That contradiction created a gap, and sometimes gaps force investigators to widen the lens. Tonight, we're moving away from surveillance images and entering something quieter: relationships. Because long before people become connected through investigations, they become connected through life. And life creates patterns. The story goes back nearly 2 decades. Back to Tucson. Back to a time when nobody was thinking about crimes, investigations, or missing persons. Back to simple advertisements and chance encounters. In 2007, people still used classified postings regularly to find opportunities. Jobs, apartments, local groups, musicians looking for band members. Ordinary things. And somewhere among those postings, several strangers crossed paths. One of them was a drummer. Another was a guitarist. Another was a man who had arrived in the United States from Italy not long before. At that point, these weren't people bound together by years of history. They weren't lifelong friends. They didn't grow up together. They didn't attend school together. There was no childhood connection stretching back decades. They simply met. And that distinction matters because sometimes people imagine close relationships as something inherited from the past. But some of the strongest relationships aren't inherited. They're built. Slowly. One conversation at a time. One rehearsal at a time. One weekend at a time. The group eventually formed a band. Like countless local bands before them, they weren't stepping into massive arenas. There were no sold-out tours. No screaming crowds. No platinum records hanging on walls. Instead, there were rehearsals. Small venues. Equipment being loaded into vehicles late at night. Long drives. Recording sessions. Hours spent creating music that might only ever reach local audiences. People who have played in bands understand something unique about that environment. You spend enormous amounts of time together. Far more than outsiders realize. You rehearse together. Travel together. Eat together. Complain together. Celebrate together. You sit in small rooms for hours trying to perfect songs nobody else has even heard yet. Friendships formed in those environments can become surprisingly deep. Because music itself creates repetition, and repetition creates familiarity. Eventually, you stop learning superficial details about people. You start learning everything else. You learn how they react under pressure. You learn their habits. You learn what frustrates them. You learn their routines. You learn their struggles. You learn what they're worried about financially. You learn who they're dating, who they're married to, what problems they're dealing with, who their families are. You begin learning the parts of people's lives that never appear publicly. Because eventually conversations move beyond music. They move into life itself. And years have a way of making those connections stronger. Months turn into years. Years become a decade. Then suddenly nearly 20 years have passed. Think about that for a moment. 19 years. 19 years is not casual familiarity. 19 years is not someone whose birthday you occasionally remember on social media. 19 years is not a person you run into once every few months. 19 years represents birthdays, vacations, conversations, life events, changes, losses, successes, failures, entire chapters of life unfolding while another person remains present. People change dramatically over 19 years. Careers change, homes change, circumstances change, personalities change, but some relationships remain. And because they remain, they become repositories of information. One person starts understanding another person's world, not because they're investigating them, not because they're secretly studying them, simply because that's what long-term friendships naturally become. Access. And that word matters here. Access. Because when investigators examine people surrounding a case, they often look beyond direct evidence and ask simple questions. Who knew the victim? Who understood the routines? Who knew where people lived? Who understood family relationships? Who had knowledge others wouldn't possess? Not because knowledge itself proves wrongdoing. It doesn't. But because access narrows possibilities. Imagine becoming close friends with someone for nearly 2 decades. You would probably know where they live. You would know who their family members are. You would know major events happening in their lives. You would know where holidays are spent. You would know what kind of challenges they deal with. You would know who they're close to. You would know things without ever consciously trying to know them. Information accumulates naturally, quietly, without effort, and that creates something investigators pay very close attention to: familiarity. Because strangers have to gather information deliberately, friends don't. Friends absorb information accidentally, and that's a major difference. If you've followed this investigation all the way to this point, this is where I need your help. Cases like these stay alive because communities continue paying attention. Share this video with someone following this case. Put your thoughts below because sometimes one overlooked detail changes everything. Subscribe and turn on notifications for Apex Crime Analyst because we're going to keep pulling records, tracking developments, and following every lead wherever. If someone completely unknown wanted details about routines, locations, family structures, and habits, gathering that information could take significant effort. But people already inside a circle often possess it automatically. That doesn't make them guilty, not remotely, but it changes investigative questions. Because once someone exists inside a trusted circle, certain barriers disappear. People lower their guard around familiar faces. They become comfortable, and comfort changes behavior. Now let's think about another detail. Throughout all of those years, one major element remained constant: marriage. Because during the entire period this friendship existed, family relationships already existed as well. Meaning these weren't isolated worlds operating separately. Lives overlap. People hear stories, attend events, meet relatives, learn names, become familiar with broader circles. Eventually, individuals who began as separate lives become connected through multiple layers. And over enough time, those layers become difficult to separate. Again, none of this establishes guilt. Let's be absolutely clear. Relationships do not equal criminal involvement. Friendships are not evidence. Knowing someone proves nothing. Millions of people have lifelong friends. Millions of people know details about one another's lives. That is normal. But investigations don't ignore relationships. They examine them. Because relationships reveal pathways. They reveal possibilities. And sometimes they reveal hidden structures nobody initially notices. Think about major criminal investigations throughout history. How often do investigators begin with complete strangers? Sometimes it happens, but very often they start closer to the center. Family, friends, co-workers, associates, people connected through proximity. Because proximity creates opportunity, and opportunity creates investigative interest. The deeper investigators go into complicated cases, the more frequently they discover that important answers weren't sitting far away. They were sitting nearby, quietly, almost invisible. And this is where things become increasingly interesting. Because until now we've only discussed connection, only history, only friendship, nothing else. But in the next section, the story begins shifting into something much heavier. Because relationships alone rarely draw national attention. Backgrounds do, records do, patterns do, past decisions do. And once those elements begin entering the picture, conversations start changing very quickly. Because eventually investigators stop asking, who knew whom? And they begin asking, what else do we know? That question opens an entirely different door. And once that door opens, things become a lot harder to ignore. In the last part, we went backward nearly 2 decades and followed a path that started in a place nobody would normally consider important. A few people met through ordinary circumstances. Music brought them together. Years passed. Relationships formed. Lives became intertwined through repetition, familiarity, and time. And by the end of that discussion, one thing became very clear. Long-term relationships create access, not because anyone is secretly gathering information, not because friendships are suspicious, simply because years naturally turn people into witnesses of each other's lives. But now we arrive at a different stage of the story. Because relationships alone don't automatically raise alarm bells. History does. Patterns do. Behavior does. And eventually investigators stop asking whether people know each other and begin asking something much more uncomfortable. What do we know about the decisions they have made in the past? Because human beings leave trails. Not just physical trails, behavioral trails, patterns of choices, patterns of risk, patterns that sometimes repeat themselves across years. And tonight we're stepping into territory that has to be approached carefully, because this is where conversations often become careless. This is where people on the internet start taking pieces of information and using them as proof of conclusions they already want to reach. That isn't what we're doing here. Because having a criminal record does not automatically make someone guilty of a completely different crime. Past mistakes do not sentence someone forever. People change. People rebuild their lives. People move beyond previous actions. That matters. But at the same time, investigators don't ignore previous behavior either. Because behavior often reveals capability. And capability is very different from guilt. Those two things should never be confused. So let's walk through this carefully. Public records associated with Dominic Evans show legal trouble that included offenses involving burglary, robbery, theft, embezzlement, and DUI-related issues. Now on paper those words can look like nothing more than labels. Just boxes checked in a court file. Just terms sitting in records. But investigators rarely stop at labels. Because labels alone tell you almost nothing. Instead they ask, what behavior exists underneath those words? What actions created those charges? What patterns emerge? Let's start with burglary. People often hear burglary and immediately think of someone stealing merchandise from a store. But legally and behaviorally, the concept is broader than that. Burglary involves entering or remaining somewhere unlawfully with intent connected to criminal activity. Now think about the behavior involved in something like that. Entering a place where you are not supposed to be. Moving through unfamiliar spaces. Understanding timing. Avoiding attention. Managing risk. Thinking about entrances and exits. Understanding how to move without attracting notice. Those are behaviors. Skills, if you want to call them that. Not skills in the sense of something admirable, but learned behaviors. Because people who repeatedly engage in those kinds of activities often become comfortable doing things many others would find stressful. Think about the average person. Imagine walking through someone else's property in complete darkness. Most people would feel immediate anxiety, heart racing, breathing changing, constantly worried about being seen, constantly worried about getting caught. Most people would panic. But people become accustomed to things through repetition. Human beings adapt remarkably fast. Repeated exposure changes emotional responses. Eventually, situations that create fear in one person become routine to another. And that's important because investigators frequently ask a simple question. Has someone demonstrated previous comfort with risk? Not because that proves anything, but because comfort with risk matters. Now let's move to robbery. Because robbery introduces a different dimension entirely. Unlike theft, robbery generally involves confrontation, human interaction, pressure, control, force, psychological dominance. Think about what that means behaviorally. Most people avoid direct confrontation. Most people avoid situations involving fear and unpredictability. Most people don't willingly place themselves into emotionally chaotic situations involving another person. Because human confrontation creates uncertainty, people react unpredictably. Victims panic. Situations escalate. Things become messy. But individuals with histories involving robbery have crossed a different threshold. They have already demonstrated willingness to operate inside environments many people instinctively avoid. Again, we're discussing behavior, not conclusions. Behavior. Then we move into theft and embezzlement. These are different categories entirely. Because unlike crimes involving immediate action, financial crimes often operate through patience, manipulation, trust, extended deception. Think about the psychology involved there. Quick impulsive actions and long-term deceptive actions often require different approaches. One involves immediate risk. The other can involve planning and maintaining appearances over time. Embezzlement especially introduces an interesting concept. Trust. Because trust creates access. You can't violate trust unless trust exists first. You cannot exploit a position you were never given. So underneath that label sits another question investigators frequently ask. How comfortable is someone with using existing relationships to gain advantages? Because that question matters. Then there is DUI. At first glance, this one seems completely disconnected from everything else. Driving under the influence appears unrelated to burglary, unrelated to theft, unrelated to robbery. People often dismiss it immediately. But behavioral analysts frequently focus less on the offense itself and more on what it potentially reflects. Risk tolerance, impulsivity, decision-making under consequences. Think about what happens psychologically when someone gets behind a wheel while intoxicated. Somewhere in that decision-making process, consequences become secondary. The possibility of harm becomes secondary. The possibility of being caught becomes secondary. Immediate action overrides future outcomes. Again, none of this means someone becomes capable of entirely different crimes. But it reveals something investigators care deeply about: relationships with consequences. Because consequences shape human behavior. Some people fear consequences intensely. Others appear more willing to test boundaries repeatedly. Now imagine stepping back and looking at everything together. Not individual charges. Not isolated incidents. Patterns. Because investigators often do exactly that. Imagine putting each behavior onto a table. Risk-taking, confrontation, unlawful entry, deception, comfort with uncertainty, tolerance for pressure. Then imagine asking, does any larger picture begin emerging? Because once multiple pieces appear beside each other, discussions change. Not because patterns equal guilt, but because patterns sometimes reveal capability. And capability creates investigative interest. Now let's return briefly to the larger case itself. Think about the person captured approaching that house, moving through darkness, approaching without obvious hesitation, operating with apparent awareness of surroundings, entering, leaving, avoiding detection, disappearing. The question investigators naturally ask becomes, would a first-time offender behave like that? Maybe. Absolutely possible. People should never underestimate what first-time offenders can do. History contains countless examples. But experienced investigators also know something else. Behavior often leaves fingerprints. Not literal fingerprints. Behavioral fingerprints. Actions that reflect familiarity with risk. Actions that suggest previous exposure to certain environments. Actions that feel practiced rather than accidental. Think about learning something simple like driving. The first time feels uncomfortable. Everything requires concentration. Mirrors, steering, speed, braking. Every movement feels deliberate. Years later, most people barely think about those actions. Behavior becomes automatic. The same concept applies broadly across human activity. Repeated exposure creates familiarity. Familiarity creates comfort. Comfort changes behavior. Now again, let me be extremely clear because this distinction matters. Nothing we're discussing here proves involvement in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because evidence determines involvement. DNA determines involvement. Technology determines involvement. Records determine involvement. Not assumptions. Not internet theories. Not public speculation. But investigators are still required to ask difficult questions. Because ignoring patterns would be irresponsible too. Imagine learning someone had previous experience entering places unlawfully. Experience involving confrontation. Experience involving deception. Would investigators ignore that information entirely? Of course not. No responsible investigator would. Because investigations don't operate by avoiding uncomfortable facts. They operate by examining them. Carefully. Objectively. Without jumping ahead of evidence. And this is where things begin shifting again. Because so far we've discussed behavior. We've discussed patterns. We've discussed capability. But capability alone doesn't solve the central problem. There's still a missing piece. A very important missing piece. Because even if someone possesses certain behavioral patterns, one major question still remains unanswered. How would multiple individuals fit together? Because one person knowing information and another person possessing certain characteristics creates a possibility that changes the structure entirely. A possibility involving roles. Separate responsibilities. Different functions inside the same operation. And once that idea enters the picture, previous contradictions start looking very different. Because in the next part we're moving away from records and into something larger. The possibility that this was never designed around one person at all. The possibility of an architect and an operative. And once we begin exploring that framework, the entire story starts shifting beneath our feet. Up to this point, we've looked at relationships. We've looked at history. We've looked at behavior patterns and past decisions. We've examined what certain records might suggest about risk tolerance, familiarity with confrontation, and access to information. But even after all of that, one major problem still remains standing in the middle of this case. The contradiction hasn't disappeared. The height issue still exists. The physical description still exists. The surveillance footage still exists. And if one person doesn't seem to fit every part of the picture, then forcing every piece into the same box may actually push us further away from the truth instead of closer to it. Because investigations sometimes fail when people become obsessed with finding one perfect suspect. Real life doesn't always operate that way. Sometimes there isn't one role. Sometimes there are several. And tonight we're stepping into a framework that changes the structure of the entire discussion. Not a conclusion, not an accusation, a framework. Because frameworks help organize evidence before evidence organizes itself. Imagine a complicated operation for a moment. Not necessarily this case. Any complicated operation. Think about how most people picture crimes in movies. One person appears from nowhere. One person creates the plan. One person carries it out. One person cleans up the mess. One person disappears. Everything rests on a single individual. But reality has a way of being less dramatic and more practical. Because every major task usually requires different abilities. One person may know how something works. Another person may know how to physically execute it. One may understand timing. One may understand logistics. One may take risks. Another may avoid being seen entirely. Different people often bring different functions. And this is where a question becomes important. What if people have been looking for the wrong role? Because perhaps the person seen on surveillance wasn't necessarily the individual sitting at the center of every theory. Maybe that person was simply carrying out a task. Maybe the individual visible on camera was not the planner. Maybe they were the operator. Let's break this into two ideas. First, imagine an architect. Not literally someone designing buildings. An architect of events. Someone who understands the environment. Someone who knows routines. Someone who understands habits. Someone familiar with schedules. Someone who knows where cameras are located. Someone who understands family relationships. Someone who possesses information that an outsider would need weeks or months to gather. An architect doesn't necessarily need to physically appear anywhere. An architect provides intelligence. They provide timing. They provide knowledge. They provide the map. Now imagine a second role. The operative. The individual responsible for direct action. The person willing to physically place themselves into dangerous situations. The person willing to approach a house in darkness. The person willing to accept immediate risk. The person willing to carry out actions directly. The operative isn't necessarily the planner. They're the execution arm. They're the movement. They're the action. And suddenly, something interesting starts happening. Because once these roles separate, several earlier problems begin looking different. Take the height issue. If the person on surveillance doesn't appear consistent with someone many people focused on, that contradiction creates problems if we're forcing one person to fit every category. But if separate roles exist, the contradiction weakens. Because now the question isn't, does one individual match everything? Now the question becomes, does one individual fit one role while another individual fits another role? That is a very different discussion. Because think about what investigators frequently examine. Motive, means, opportunity. Most people know those three concepts. But complicated investigations sometimes introduce another element. Capability distribution. Who knows what? Who can do what? Who had access to what? Who brings which skill set into the picture? Because different people sometimes provide different components. One person may possess access. Another person may possess nerve. One person may understand family routines. Another may possess experience involving risk. One person may remain invisible while another becomes visible. And once that possibility enters the conversation, previous questions start rearranging themselves. Imagine someone wanting information about a house, information about timing, information about routines, information about camera placement, information about habits. Could an outsider gather all of that? Absolutely. Investigators, no strangers, sometimes spend weeks learning details before committing crimes. But someone already inside a trusted circle begins with a massive advantage. They don't need to build knowledge from scratch. They may already possess pieces of it naturally. Now imagine needing someone willing to physically act. Someone willing to move through uncertainty. Someone willing to step into risk directly. That creates an entirely different requirement. Because knowledge and action aren't always found in the same person. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they don't. And history repeatedly shows that roles inside operations often divide naturally. One person thinks. One person acts. One person coordinates. One person moves. Again, none of this proves anything. Let's be clear. Frameworks are not evidence. Theories are not evidence. Possibilities are not evidence. Evidence remains evidence. DNA is evidence. Phone records are evidence. Digital movement is evidence. Surveillance is evidence. Those things speak much louder than theories ever will. But theories still matter because they create questions. And good questions lead investigators toward answers. Because if multiple people become part of the equation, suddenly several earlier inconsistencies stop looking like dead ends. Now they start looking like missing sections. Missing sections of a larger structure. And in the next part, we're moving away from behavioral frameworks and stepping towards something much more concrete. Physical evidence. DNA. Movement patterns. Surveillance details. Because eventually every theory reaches a point where it either becomes stronger or starts falling apart. And evidence is where that process begins. Up to this point, we've walked through relationships, history, behavioral patterns, and the possibility that multiple roles may exist inside a larger framework. We explored the idea that not every question in an investigation is answered by forcing a single person into every category. Sometimes one person knows the environment while another person carries out actions directly. Sometimes different pieces belong to different people. But theories eventually run into a wall. And that wall is evidence. Because speculation can stretch in countless directions, people can create explanations for almost anything. Entire communities online can build timelines, compare photographs, debate motives, and develop elaborate scenarios that sound convincing. But evidence doesn't care what sounds convincing. Evidence doesn't care what people want to believe. Evidence doesn't care about public opinion. Evidence simply exists. And tonight we reach the point where discussion begins moving away from possibilities and starts entering territory that investigators take very seriously. Physical evidence. Because once biology enters an investigation, stories become harder to control. People can explain behavior. People can explain relationships. People can explain coincidences. DNA is much harder to explain away. Now let's think about something for a moment. Imagine investigators processing a scene and discovering one unknown DNA profile connected to the case. One profile creates one path, one unknown individual, one person to identify, one direction to follow. That alone can become incredibly complicated. But now imagine something different. Imagine investigators finding another biological profile entirely. Not in the same place. Not from the same item. Not belonging to the same person. Suddenly the landscape changes. Because now investigators aren't looking at one unknown identity. They're looking at two. And two changes everything. Because one profile can sometimes create uncertainty. Two profiles begin creating structure. Think about how investigators approach something like that. Immediately questions start appearing. Who are these individuals? Why are they present? How did they get there? Do they know each other? Were they there at different times? Were they there for unrelated reasons? Or are they connected somehow? Those questions become unavoidable. Because multiple biological signatures create multiple pathways. And pathways can eventually intersect. Now imagine one profile is recovered from an item found outside the residence, along what could potentially represent movement away from the scene. Then imagine another profile originating from evidence recovered inside the residence itself. Immediately investigators start separating environments. Outside, inside, movement, location, sequence. Because locations tell stories. The same way footprints tell stories. The same way fingerprints tell stories. DNA tells stories. Not complete stories at first, but pieces of stories. And sometimes those pieces begin fitting together in ways nobody initially expects. Now let's return to the possibility we discussed previously. The idea of multiple roles. The architect and operative framework. Because if multiple individuals existed inside a larger operation, physical evidence suddenly becomes much more significant. Think about the logistics for a moment. Imagine trying to remove an elderly individual from a residence during the middle of the night. Not a younger person. Not someone capable of moving quickly. Not someone physically prepared for sudden movement. Someone older. someone vulnerable, someone requiring careful handling. That creates complications immediately, because movement becomes slower. Everything becomes slower. Walking becomes slower. Exiting becomes slower. Positioning becomes slower. Time expands. And time creates risk. Because every additional second introduces opportunities for something to go wrong. A neighbor waking up. A vehicle passing nearby. A dog barking unexpectedly. A motion sensor activating. A light turning on. Every additional moment increases exposure. So ask yourself something. Could one individual handle every responsibility simultaneously? Maybe. Absolutely possible. But imagine the practical side of it. Someone inside managing movement while also monitoring surroundings. Someone controlling a situation while simultaneously watching for approaching vehicles. Someone assisting movement while also remaining alert for cameras, neighbors, and unexpected interruptions. That becomes increasingly complicated, because people can only focus on so many things at once. Now imagine a different possibility. One individual managing activity directly. Another individual positioned elsewhere. Watching, monitoring, paying attention to surroundings. Immediately the picture begins looking different. Again, that doesn't prove anything, but it creates a structure investigators would absolutely consider. Because complicated actions often require coordination, and coordination frequently leaves traces. Sometimes those traces appear through digital movement, sometimes through surveillance footage, sometimes through communication records, sometimes through biology. And biological evidence has one major advantage. People forget about it. Human beings leave pieces of themselves everywhere. Hair, skin cells, touch DNA, biological residue, so small that individuals don't even realize they've left it behind. You can wear gloves and still leave something. You can be careful and still leave something. You can think you've controlled every variable and still miss one tiny detail. Because perfection rarely exists. And investigations often succeed because people overestimate how much control they had. Now imagine investigators not only examining DNA, but combining that information with movement patterns. Cell tower activity, vehicle routes, surveillance windows, geographic timelines. Because evidence rarely operates alone. Evidence stacks. One piece supports another. One detail strengthens another. One discovery narrows another. Think of it like constructing a bridge. A single cable doesn't hold everything up. Multiple supports create strength. And investigators understand that very well. DNA by itself may create one lead. Phone movement creates another. Travel patterns create another. Surveillance timing creates another. Then suddenly separate pieces begin connecting. And once connections appear, possibilities become smaller. Much smaller. Which brings us back to something we discussed earlier. The idea that eventually theories reach a breaking point. Because every theory eventually faces evidence. Some survive. Some collapse. Some become stronger. Others disappear entirely. And that moment is where this case may ultimately be heading. Because if physical evidence starts connecting people, locations, and movement patterns together, speculation stops carrying the story. Evidence takes over. And evidence speaks much louder than anyone else ever can. But there is still one final stage remaining. Because evidence doesn't exist inside a vacuum. Investigators are still working. Tips are still arriving. Technology is still advancing. People are still watching. And somewhere inside all of this, pressure continues building. Because in the next part we're stepping into the present moment itself. The investigation. The silence. The mounting pressure. And the question hanging over everyone connected to this case. How long can secrets survive once evidence starts getting closer? Welcome back to Apex Crime Analyst. We've reached the point in this story where theories begin running out of room. We've gone through timelines. We've examined relationships. We looked at long-term connections, behavioral patterns, possible roles, and physical evidence. We explored the possibility that this case may involve more complexity than a simple one-person explanation. We followed pathways that started with ordinary events and eventually led into questions nobody expected to ask. But now we arrive at something very different. Pressure. Because investigations change over time. The first stage is chaos. The second stage is attention. The third stage is patience. And patience is where things become dangerous for whoever may be hiding behind unanswered questions. Because people often imagine investigations as something dramatic and immediate. They imagine detectives kicking down doors within days. They imagine suspects making mistakes instantly. They imagine truth appearing suddenly in one giant breakthrough moment. Real investigations rarely work that way. Real investigations are often slower. Much slower. At first, there are helicopters in the sky, news cameras parked outside homes, hundreds of investigators moving through neighborhoods, search teams, interviews, breaking news alerts. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels active. Everything feels like movement. But eventually the noise begins fading. The cameras leave. News coverage slows down. National attention starts shifting elsewhere. The public begins moving toward newer stories. And that creates an illusion. An illusion that nothing is happening anymore. But behind closed doors, something entirely different begins. The work that matters most. Because once public attention decreases, investigations often enter their most dangerous phase. Quiet work. The work nobody sees. The work that doesn't appear on television. The work involving data, records, laboratories, and digital reconstruction. Because somewhere, right now, investigators may still be looking at movement patterns, still looking at phone activity, still reconstructing timelines, still comparing records, still analyzing biological evidence, still asking questions. And every passing day creates more pressure. Not necessarily pressure from investigators standing outside someone's house. Pressure from uncertainty itself. Because uncertainty does something strange to people. Human beings can tolerate many things. But prolonged uncertainty often breaks people in ways they don't expect. Think about carrying a secret. Think about carrying a lie. Think about carrying information that nobody else knows. For one day, maybe that burden feels manageable. For 1 week, perhaps it still feels possible. For several months? For years? The weight changes. Because secrets aren't static. They grow. Especially when people become afraid. And fear changes behavior. Fear changes sleep. Fear changes routines. Fear changes decision-making. Because imagine waking up every day wondering whether evidence is getting closer. Imagine hearing news reports and wondering whether investigators discovered something overnight. Imagine watching updates and wondering whether a laboratory somewhere just connected another piece. Imagine hearing words like DNA analysis, genealogical testing, cell data, digital reconstruction. Imagine hearing those things and not knowing what investigators know. That uncertainty becomes its own punishment. Because technology doesn't stop. Databases don't stop. Analysis doesn't stop. Investigators don't stop. And time doesn't always help people the way they think it will. Many people believe time helps evidence disappear. Sometimes the opposite happens. Time gives technology opportunities to catch up. Years ago, cases considered impossible suddenly became solvable because technology improved. Cases that sat untouched for decades suddenly reopened. Names appeared. Arrests happened. Families received answers. People who believed they had escaped scrutiny discovered that evidence had simply been waiting for science to catch up. Waiting for databases to expand, waiting for one relative somewhere to upload information that unknowingly changed everything. Think about that reality. Somewhere a person might submit a DNA sample to learn about family history, to discover ancestry, to build a family tree. Completely harmless intentions, completely ordinary actions. Yet years later, those same databases have helped investigators identify people connected to crimes once considered unsolvable. That reality changes the landscape completely. Because the old idea of disappearing forever becomes much harder now. People leave pieces of themselves everywhere. Digital footprints, movement patterns, biological traces, communication records. And sometimes they don't even realize those pieces exist. But there is another form of pressure building here too. Human pressure. Because if more than one person knows something, silence becomes more fragile. Think about that carefully. One individual carrying information creates one point of failure. Two individuals create 2 points of failure. Three creates 3. And every additional person introduces new variables. Different personalities, different fears, different loyalties, different breaking points. Some people stay silent forever. Others don't. History repeatedly shows something fascinating. Large secrets become harder to protect as more people enter the circle. Because eventually relationships change. Friendships change. People argue. People separate. Money enters situations. Fear enters situations. Regret enters situations. And suddenly loyalty begins competing with self-preservation. Self-preservation often wins, especially when rewards exist, especially when consequences become larger, especially when evidence starts feeling close. Because someone out there may know something. Someone may have seen something. Someone may have heard something they dismissed months ago. Someone may have information they believe doesn't matter. But tiny details solve cases every year. Tiny details. A vehicle, a conversation, a route, a name, a location. Something that feels meaningless to one person can become critical to investigators. And that's why this story still matters. Because at the center of everything we've discussed, beyond theories and speculation and timelines, one reality remains unchanged. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. An 84-year-old woman disappeared. A family still wants answers. And somewhere the truth already exists. The truth isn't missing. The truth is sitting somewhere with someone. Someone knows where she is. Someone knows what happened that night. Someone knows details that the public does not. The question has never been whether the truth exists. The question has always been how long it can stay hidden. Because eventually evidence speaks. Eventually technology speaks. Eventually records speak. And eventually people speak. The only uncertainty is which one gets there first. If you've followed this investigation all the way to this point, this is where I need your help. Cases like these stay alive because communities continue paying attention. Share this video with someone following this case. Put your thoughts below because sometimes one overlooked detail changes everything. Subscribe and turn on notifications for Apex Crime Analyst because we're going to keep pulling records, tracking developments, and following every lead wherever the evidence takes us. And when the next piece drops, whether it's DNA, a new timeline, or a breakthrough nobody saw coming, you'll hear it here first.